Okay, custom audiences and lookalike audiences part 2. We talked about custom audiences in the previous lesson, so let's focus on lookalike audiences now. Here's what you have to do. Create a 1%, a 5%, and a 10% lookalike audience. Generally speaking, if you're going after larger audiences, larger lookalike audiences, you will see lower CPCs and lower CPMs. Of course, you can never say that a 5% and a 10% lookalike audience will always outperform a 1% lookalike audience when you're looking at the cost per lead or the cost per purchase. However, looking at the CPCs and the CPMs, generally speaking, bigger audiences result in lower CPCs and lower CPMs. So you always have to split test a 1%, a 5%, and a 10% lookalike audience. Now, depending on your budget, either start with a 1% lookalike audience only or split test a 1%, a 5%, and a 10% lookalike audience simultaneously. If your budget is limited, start with a 1% lookalike audience, and if you have something that you want to optimize or scale, then you can split test a 5 and a 10% against a 1% lookalike audience. But if you're working with larger budgets, then I recommend starting out right away with a 1%, a 5%, and a 10% lookalike audience. What some marketers do is creating lookalike audience segments. So you have, for example, a 2 to 3%, a 3 to 4%, and a 5 to 6% lookalike audience. Problem here is those audiences are too narrow. You're not getting rewarded with lower CPCs and lower CPMs. This is what we essentially want, and also audience overlap is not really becoming an issue because, first of all, you're working with bigger audiences. Audience overlap is only an issue with small audiences. And second of all, audience overlap is not really reflected in a higher price in the auction. And especially on the ad set level, audience overlap is nothing you have to worry about. So I do not recommend breaking up a lookalike audience into those small baby lookalike audiences. Go after bigger lookalike audiences, 1%, 5%, and a 10% lookalike audience. Speaking of big lookalike audiences, via Facebook's API, you can even create a 20% lookalike audience, but that's something you should only consider if you are working with really big budgets and you're in the process of scaling a campaign. Last but not least, work with international lookalike audiences. What does that mean? If you want to take a campaign from Australia to the United States. So let's say you launched a campaign in Australia, you're scaling that campaign with a 5% lookalike audience that's based on a Australian seed audience. If you want to launch a new campaign in the States, you don't have to create a seed audience first that's made up of Facebook users from the United States on behalf of with interest targeting and behavioral targeting. No, you can take your Australian seed audience and you can create a US lookalike audience with the Australian seed audience essentially, right? So everything that you essentially need to scale a campaign internationally is a high quality seed audience. That's what you need. And then you can create a German, a Canadian, a French lookalike audience based on the one seed audience that you have. Of course, and I think that's pretty obvious, you should split test different seed audiences later down the road. So for example, if you started out with an Australian seed audience and if you made a decent amount of purchases and a decent amount of sales in the States and you have a new seed audience, of course, split test those two different seed audiences. Split test an Australian seed audience, the audience you started out with, against the new seed audience that contains US buyers, but still to start out, one seed audience is enough.